You are listening to the Reading for the Glory podcast. Join us as we have meaningful conversations that will help us discover truth, goodness, and beauty through the written word. For more information and additional resources, please visit readingfortheglory.com.
Preparing for ministry is about more than earning a degree. It's about becoming the man or woman God has called you to be. It's about living alongside your brothers and sisters in Christ, growing and learning together as you follow God's leading in your life.
At Stanford University's Beeson Divinity School, we not only believe these truths, we live them. We're committed to in-person, face-to-face education for the purpose of face-to-face gospel ministry. The small class sizes, along with opportunities to worship, pray, eat, and gather together, make Beeson a community uniquely equipped to provide world-class ministry training within the evangelical tradition.
Beeson welcomes students from a variety of Protestant backgrounds, celebrating denominational diversity within its faculty and student body. This interdenominational spirit encourages you to grow in your own convictions, while learning to appreciate those from other backgrounds.
Beeson's renowned faculty train you to not only be excellent ministers, but to be fully committed disciples of Jesus Christ.
What's so striking about the faculty at Beeson is that they're personally invested in our lives. In a lot of ways, I think that God chose Beeson for me. He placed me at Beeson at the perfect time to form relationships with professors, with those in my mentor group, for the sake of growing me to look more like Christ and growing me to serve alongside these people together in future ministry.
Not only do classes form me, but the walks around the quad and the lunches week by week form me to be more pastoral, more caring, a better listener. As you consider God's call in your life, we hope you'll join us here and experience the Beeson difference.
Welcome back to the Reading for the Glory podcast. I'm your host, Zach Kendrick. I serve as the executive director here at Reading for the Glory, and today we have another great conversation coming your way. Today I am joined by Dr. Daniel Hummel. For those of you who are not aware of his work, Daniel is the director of the Lumen Center in Madison, Wisconsin, and a research fellow in history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin and is the author of the book, The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, How the Evangelical Battle over the End Times Shaped a Nation. So welcome to the Reading for the Glory podcast, Daniel.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Zach.
Yeah, so we're glad to have you today, and that's going to be the topic of our discussion, your book, The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. But before we do that, I want to remind our listeners about an ongoing opportunity that we have for anyone who's able to become a monthly supporter of Reading for the Glory. We would love to send you a free book as a thank you for that. And so if you would like more information about that opportunity, you can visit readingfortheglory.com/free gift. Well, your book has been out a little over 2 years now. So in that time since it originally came out, how's it been received, both maybe in the academic world, but also in the popular world as well, the just general Christian book world?
Yeah, and of course, those two communities, the academic world, the more public Christian world, very different sort of timelines for receiving feedback. The academic world takes a lot longer. So honestly, I've read reviews of my book in the last couple months in the academic world, which is always interesting, sort of years after you've finished a project. I would say, to stick with the academic world just quickly, there has been a happy coincidence of a number of books on dispensationalism, mine just being one of them, being published by academic presses, by academics in the last couple years, some of them coming out right around when I did my book. And there's a book by Crawford Gribben, who's a historian in Ireland, on a new biography of John Nelson Darby, the founder of dispensationalism in a lot of ways, at least modern dispensationalism. There's a massive 3-volume series that just concluded by a historian named Donald Atkinson on the Brethren, the early Plymouth Brethren movement. And then my book came out, and then there's been a number of theology books, one of them called After Dispensationalism, that came out as well. So I would say that what I was pleased by is that a lot of us are, particularly the historians, are sort of cohering around a certain interpretation of dispensationalism and it's close to the one I promote in my book, which is that there's a really important interpretive history to be done between the origins of dispensationalism in the 19th century and then what you get in the 20th century in the American church in the sort of popularized, left behind type dispensations. There's a lot of steps between the origins and now, and a lot of those steps have to do with things that aren't the sort of purely theological, things like American culture, politics, the state of the world, things that happen in the church world that aren't related exactly to theology. And so really, in some ways, just making it a cultural, intellectual history of dispensationalism. So I've been happy with the way that the book has been talked about in those settings. I've also been really just humbled and happy to have had a lot of conversation around the book in the more church world on podcasts like this one, reviewed in places like Christian magazines and things like that. Of course, the response is highly dependent on where the responders are coming from in the church in terms of whether they appreciate my depiction of the history of dispensationalism, whether they think it actually is falling or it has already fallen or it should never fall. And so how dare you even talk about it falling? All those types of, I've heard all those types of opinions, but I guess I've been encouraged that most of them have been constructive and at least searching for dialogue, which is what I really hope to do. Anytime I feel like I've overstated something, I feel bad because I don't want to shut down dialogue, particularly among Christians, about our history and about the role of theology in the life of our churches, good theology, bad theology, and everything in between. So we were just talking before, the paperback edition of the book is coming out in May of 2025 here, and it'll be interesting to see if there's yet further conversation around it. But the only other thing I'll say is there was a difference in the conversation after October of 2023, which is when the Gaza war started in the Middle East. And because of the way that some Christians in America responded to that war, sort of situating it within prophecy, situating the attacks on October 7th against Israel from Hamas in prophetic terms, there was this extra layer of conversation around sort of the politics of dispensationalism. The book before this one that I wrote was on Christian Zionism, so I happened to be quite familiar with sort of that territory. But it was interesting to see some of that was just further polarization, people who don't like dispensationalism sort of further blaming dispensationalists for some of the ways American foreign policy functions, and dispensationalists sort of further trying to defend their position and clarify exactly how they view Israel. And not all of that was black and white. There were a lot of very thoughtful people in both camps doing that work. But I will say that that was one sort of external event that shaped how I talked about the book as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think about it in those terms. And we will get a little bit into that further in the conversation as we go a little bit deeper regarding the theology of dispensationalism and end times prophecy and that sort of thing. Before we do that, for many people in evangelical Christianity here in America, and particularly as I think about my own upbringing in the Southern Baptist context, I grew up Southern Baptist. I'm actually no longer Southern Baptist. I'm in the Anglican tradition now. But most people in my upbringing growing up, even if they didn't use the word dispensational or dispensationalism, or they didn't even know who John Nelson Darby was, and that name didn't come up in conversation, they were definitely dispensational in their practice, especially regarding end times and that sort of stuff. And I love how Mark Knoll, in his foreword to your book, speaking about this topic, he says that your great contribution is that you take a story that everyone knows and you show how that, even though everybody knows that, it's barely scratched the surface. And so people might have like a broad view of what it is, but may not be able to articulate that. Let's start basic as we continue the conversation. What is dispensationalism?
Right. And just to link it to that story you have about your Southern Baptist upbringing, I think many people, if they haven't read a lot of history of dispensationalism, might assume that it's a Southern, or it's sort of an integral part of Southern Christianity, going back centuries, maybe part of the old-time gospel or old-time religion. And in fact, the story of the South and dispensationalism is actually quite recent. It really is in the 20th century that it gets introduced in any significant way into the Southern Baptist world. And that before that, dispensationalism was actually considered a northern sort of phenomenon. It was in the northern states in New England and in the upper Midwest that it was really powerful. So that's just one instance of sort of how the story might seem one way if you're just sort of looking at where you experience dispensationalism today, or if you grow up in a community that's very thick in that way of thinking about the end times in particular, versus what the history would tell you. If we're thinking about the definition, there's a lot of ways to start, but I tend to like starting with what people are probably most familiar with, but also just to minimize that the eschatology or the end times part of dispensationalism is really only one part of what dispensationalism is. And so we would do a disservice just to focus on that. Most of us, if we're at all familiar with the evangelical world, even if we're not, even if we are consumers of Hollywood movies and other things, you might come across the idea of the rapture being this any moment event in the near future where the true Christians will get whisked up into heaven, and it will begin a sort of fulfillment of prophecies in the book of Revelation that are pretty horrible, that include a literal sort of individual antichrist, some figure who's going to control the globe, who's going to oppress Christians, force Christians to take the mark of the beast, that will culminate in the Battle of Armageddon, which will be a literal battle in Tel Megiddo, which is an area in modern day Israel, and that battle will be won by Jesus and his army that will usher in the millennial kingdom. That's a really top level, but sort of version of the dispensationalist interpretation of future biblical prophecy. And many Christians think that's what dispensationalism is. Many Americans do. And that's certainly the part of the system that has been the most popular, certainly the most visually interesting, and sort of has a lot of material for novels like the Left Behind books and other things in there. But dispensationalism is more fundamentally than an eschatology. It's a hermeneutic for reading the Bible that develops some pretty strong commitments that aren't, they sort of implicate eschatology, but they're not really about eschatology. And that hermeneutic today would be described as a literal or plain reading of the text that treats all parts of the Bible essentially in the plain language understanding of that passage down to the sentence and grammatical level. And what dispensationalists say this does is produce a couple different sort of distinctions that come out of the Bible. The most important one being that there are two peoples of God that are coexistent. Most Christians would imagine that in the Old Testament, ancient Israel is sort of the covenanted people with God, and then Jesus comes, his ministry, death and resurrection, we get the church, and that becomes the more expansive vision of God's chosen people. Dispensationalists insist that Israel continues to have a special role to play with God. And so this is often called the church-Israel distinction, but it's the thing that sort of runs through the entire reading of the Bible for dispensationalists that allows them to organize the different parts of the Bible as whether they're applying to the church or to Israel. And this gets really important when we get to prophecy and whether the prophecies of Ezekiel or Jeremiah or Revelation or Daniel should be things that we read into about national Israel or about the broader sort of scene and the church. That becomes sort of the foundation for where the word dispensationalism comes from, idea of dispensations or discrete periods of time where God is working with humanity in special ways based on sort of economies of God is how they would talk about it. And so the dispensations are various numbers, depend on who you talk to. There's no sort of set number. There tends to be a sort of gravitation to 7. The Scofield Bible, which was one of the most important presenters of this, had 7 dispensations. The first dispensation is innocence, which starts in the Garden of Eden. The last dispensation is the kingdom or the millennial kingdom, which is in the future. And then there are a number of dispensations in between that are where God is distinctly working with either the church or Israel. And this creates a history of redemption or a narrative of redemption in the Bible that, when theologians talk about it, has much sharper discontinuities in it than a more covenantalist reading, which sees a lot of continuity between the ways God works in each age. And there's a lot of things that sort of flow from these core things, but really, if you were to pin down a dispensationalist, they would say something about the church-Israel distinction. They would say something about the differentiation in times that God is working with humanity. They would say something about the literal hermeneutic that they're applying, and then they might get to the eschatology after that as sort of the implications of these things upstream that they're seeing in the Bible.
I think that's very helpful to distinguish, because I know, as I set that question up, when I think about it, most of the time that did have to do with eschatology. I know people that I love very much in churches growing up would be very dogmatic on the dispensational eschatology of the rapture and that sort of thing, but maybe they didn't have a full dispensational view regarding hermeneutics. And so do you think a lot of that has to do with you mentioned the Scofield Bible? I know that my family growing up, that was the Bible that was probably used in their churches, specifically regarding like the pastors they had and that sort of thing. Is that, you think, what popularized it among, especially in the South, Baptist churches, that old time gospel in the South, or is there something else going on there?
That's a big part of it. That's one of the best-selling annotated Bibles in the 20th century. So there's a lot of copies of that circulating. I think what you observe is really interesting to me, and it confirms sort of how I think about this too, which is there's a lot of Christians that are going around where the eschatology is not grounded in the broader system. It sort of sits there, and maybe the broader system, I mean, most people don't have a systematic theology as they're walking around, at least not explicit. It might be implicit, but they couldn't articulate it. And that phenomenon, I think, has more to do with the second half of the 20th century and the popularization of what I call in my book pop dispensationalism, but this largely end times focused telling of the eschatology of dispensationalism that's often presented without any of the rest of the system. And so that's where like The Late Great Planet Earth is the best-selling nonfiction book of the 1970s. It's all about the future and what's going to happen in the Middle East and with the Soviet Union and so forth. And there are references in that book, which is written by Hal Lindsey, who got his degree at Dallas Seminary and was a full-blown, dispensationalist. But he doesn't present the system in that book. It's a very pop level. It's trying to tap into the counterculture of the 60s. And he's not there to do a systematic theology. And so that book circulates. A lot of people like what they're reading in the book, but they're not then investing in the system. They're investing in this particular telling of the future. The same thing with the Left Behind novels in the 90s. There's, of course, a whole world of theology operating for Tim LaHaye, who's one of the authors of that book, and Jerry Jenkins, who's the other author. But in the books themselves, you're getting, sort of a thriller novel with this stuff happening in the background. And so and this is, part of this is the way, unfortunately, the American church and the spiritual formation happened, which is there's a lot of popular level literature out there that is consumed and then internalized by Christians. And they might be grounded in that stuff more than in the Bible. You just never know, but they might be reading that stuff more than they're reading their Bible on a weekly basis. And so they become very convinced or very invested in certain theological understandings of what's going to happen in the future or what the modern nation of Israel signifies to a Christian. But it's not really connected to a deeper wrestling with a systematic theology or a biblical theology that would maybe cause them to rethink some of those things. So I think that's a very common thing. I don't think it's just eschatology where this happens. This happens in all parts of sort of the church today, but it's particularly acute and maybe because it bleeds into politics so quickly in things like U.S.-Israel relations, it just is a lot more on the tip of our tongues when we're thinking about how this pop formation of American Christians intersects with the world.
And I think it's very dangerous, I think, for Christians to be catechized by pop culture, not necessarily broad pop culture, yes, that too, but this sub pop culture of Christian literature and that sort of thing that may not necessarily be fully biblical, and then be, like you said, formed spiritually, catechized. And so I think it leaves room for people to have, well, the Bible says, and then they might be quoting from the Left Behind, but not actually the book of Revelation or other parts of the Bible that talk about end times. And I think it's also, as you think about the broader system of the dispensational hermeneutic of a very strict literal reading of the Bible and even the two peoples of God understanding of that, to me, that can be also very problematic, because then there is this sense in which, because I know I had a conversation a few years back with a gentleman who was very set on his, especially eschatology, dispensational eschatology, and he basically supported an idea of salvation one way for Christians and salvation for the Jews in another way. Can you speak to that a little bit in regards to dispensationalism and the problems with that and how that can be rectified by proper hermeneutics?
Yeah, and that's an unfortunate. This is one area where it's important, I think, to distinguish between what I call academic or scholarly dispensationalism and then pop dispensationalism. I think if you were to get most of the leading dispensationalist scholars in the room, they would uniformly reject any idea that there's two ways to salvation, that there's a separate, way for Jews in particular. They would say everyone comes to salvation through the grace of God and the blood of Jesus Christ. But on the popular level, and there have been examples further in the past of some of the leaders of dispensationalism being unclear on this point, there has been a lot of what's sometimes called dual covenant theology. Other times there's been this really stark division between law and grace that has meant that sort of there's a way to get to heaven through the law dispensations, and then there's another way to get to heaven through the grace dispensation. That has meant that dispensationalists have had to defend against this critique over and over again, including in the Scofield Bible. The original notes of Scofield were not clear on this. He insisted, outside of the Bible, the reference Bible, that he thought there was only one way to salvation, and it was through Jesus Christ, the grace of Jesus Christ. But in the actual notes, that was not clear. And there were easy ways to misread, or not even to misread, but just to interpret his notes in ways that seemed to push against that. So this is one of the questions, you could say, that comes out of the system, is if there are these strongly discontinuity between the dispensations, what does that mean for a unified, consistent sort of relationship between God and humanity? And how are we supposed to understand the relationship between ancient Israel and the church? And these are questions that theologians have talked about a lot. And again, there are more academic presentations of dispensationalism that don't get to sell their books in the millions and are usually in seminaries or somewhere like that, where they have good answers for these, or at least they try to provide answers that would keep them within the orthodox views of Christians, going back to the first century. But they're often swamped by the popular dispensationalists who either don't care about these distinctions, who actually are dual covenant, which are some of the televangelists, some of the more political evangelicals on Israel are dual covenant, either in practice or in their belief. Some of the practices, there's been a strong sort of discouragement by many what we call Christian Zionists, sort of these really active evangelicals supporting Israel, to not even send missionaries to the Jewish people. Some of that's practical. Some of it's about trying to keep a warm relationship with Israel and Jewish communities. But some of it's out of conviction that this is actually not what the Bible teaches, that the Bible teaches that Israel will only convert at the end of time, or even in some cases that Israel has a separate destiny from the church, even in the eternal state at the end. So you never want to judge a theology by its most extreme misinterpreters. And so I wouldn't want to sort of cast all dispensationalists in one category, but it's also hard not to notice that there are a number, in some cases, a majority of dispensationalists, depending on the community, who seem to take these beliefs about a Church-Israel distinction to conclusions that make you think that there are, at least if not separate ways to salvation, separate programs or ways that God is relating. And that seems to me to cut against the universality of the gospel and the call that we have at the end of Matthew and elsewhere to go make disciples of all nations.
No, I think you're very right on that. And yeah, just some of those problems are reasons why I personally am not a dispensational and would encourage other people to not be as well. But I don't know, that's not the point of your book necessarily. But you're talking about missionary work, and it's very interesting that people would say very hardline or very fringe. Maybe dispensationals would say don't go evangelize the Jewish people. But when you think about mission work, in the 19th and then in the 20th centuries, missionary work became, especially among Protestant evangelicals, became very prominent. When you think about like the missionary work of like William Carey, but then if you think about one of the most famous examples of the 20th century, you think about Jim Elliot, and he himself was a part of the Plymouth Brethren. Is there a connection there between a belief in the dispensational view of Scripture and not just eschatology, but just the worldview, and it working itself out through missions efforts?
Yeah, and I would say I was a missionary kid. I'm the son of missionaries. My dad got his MDiv at Dallas Theological Seminary, so we were, I guess you could say, dispensationalist missionaries. This is one of the things I really appreciate about the dispensationalist tradition is they have been very much mission minded ever since the 19th century. I think there's at least two reasons why that is something that dispensationalists have become known for. One is the end times sort of framing of the contemporary moment, even the contemporary moment, whether it's 1890 or 1990 or 2025. It's the sense that time is short and that every soul counts and deserves to hear the gospel. And so there has been a desire by evangelicals going back to John Nelson Darby, the Brethren. The Plymouth Brethren were very mission minded. They were some of the first dissenter groups in Great Britain to send missionaries to the Middle East and to Southeast Asia and other places. So this is in the DNA since the beginning. But certainly when you get to the late 19th century, you get these massive global missions movements in conservative evangelicalism through Dwight Moody and people around him. Even Cyrus Scofield, he helped found Central American Missions, which is still around and doing good work. So the time is short. There's an urgency. That's one part of it. The other part is the way that within dispensational theology, there's a very strong division between the sacred and secular world and between the church and the world that mirrors that. And so dispensationalists have tended to be very skeptical of social engagement, certainly of politicking or something like that, though that might be confusing because we do have some examples later in the 20th century I can try to explain that. But certainly when you go back to the 19th century, the idea was the church has you could say from some traditions, a very narrow set of responsibilities. And those responsibilities are largely about the spiritual welfare of the people in the church and of spreading the gospel elsewhere. And anything else besides that is sort of off mission. And so because of that laser focus, many of the dispensationalist communities really emphasize discipleship within the church and missions and connected those things too, and really thought that the sort of most fulfilling vocation for a lay Christian would be to become a missionary, either in the United States, in some type of urban setting or something like that, or going abroad. And Dwight Moody was at the forefront of that. People like Arthur Pearson, Cyrus Scofield, Reuben Torrey. These are some names. If you do your sort of evangelical history, you'll notice those names. They often combine missions with revival work and saw the two together. So there's a lot of revivalism, and there's a lot of sense of reaching the lost that is at the core of dispensation. So that's been in the tradition the whole time, and I would say is one of the more positive elements of dispensationalism that we can point to today.
No, I would totally agree. That fulfillment of the Great Commission is something that all Christians, no matter what your eschatology or hermeneutic is, that's something that we must be about and very much appreciate it from the dispensational point of view. And even, it makes sense coming from, a Baptist upbringing. That is definitely was at the fore of not just eschatology, but we got to go get the lost. They're out there. We got to bring them in, do mission work, both domestically and internationally. And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Diving into your book a little bit more, as a historian, you approach it historically and not just merely theologically. And so you break the book up into three parts, 1830 to 1900, 1900 to 1960, and then 1960 to 2020, where you cut off. The book was published in 2023, so you had to cut it off somewhere there. Can you share a brief history of each of these? I know people can get more reading the book, but because you were talking about at the beginning of our conversation, how it moved from Darby in the 1800s, and then how it looked from like 1960 to 2020 is very different probably from that early. Can you kind of walk through that a little bit and kind of note those distinctions between the founding or the beginning of it to current day?
Yeah. So in that first period, 1830 to 1900, I started in 1830 because that's roughly the year that John Nelson Darby starts writing about the rapture and about related topics that become some of the bedrock of dispensationalism. And in this period, there is no term called dispensationalism. It hasn't been invented. Darby was not interested in starting a systematic theology. He founded a sort of fringe, small dissenter movement in Great Britain called the Plymouth Brethren. And to me, the remarkable part about this period is how this largely unnoted, not prominent person becomes the vessel for these ideas spreading throughout the American Christian church by the end of the 19th century. And Darby had no real love for the United States. He hated revivalism. The Plymouth Brethren didn't believe in clericalism, so they didn't believe in professional pastors. He really didn't like American culture. He thought it was crude and unsophisticated. So it's really sort of ironic that his ideas become so popular among certain Americans, and particularly professional clergy in the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopal Church and other places in the late 19th century. So that first part is just tracing where do these ideas come from, and then how do they enter into the American Christian bloodstream in a way that makes sense for the timing. I really am emphasizing the role of the Civil War and Reconstruction in how American Christians are rethinking their theology, particularly their theology of the church, and then their embrace of global missions in the late 19th century, and how Darby's ideas are making sense to them in these moments because of other things happening in their world as well. And I'm also emphasizing that even though Darby originated these ideas, he loses control of how these ideas are deployed pretty quickly. And so Americans like Dwight Moody, like a guy in St. Louis named James Brooks, who's a very important Presbyterian pastor, like Cyrus Schofield, are reading the ideas by Darby and some of the other brethren authors right around Darby, but they're deploying them in this American Protestant sort of low church context that's very different than what the brethren context in the UK. And at that point, Darby becomes less relevant because he gave the ideas, but then people aren't consulting him after that point. He dies in 1882, so of course after that he's out of the picture as well. But by the time we get to 1900, my contention is that there's a set of these ideas or a version of them that become basically the backbone of the Moody movement, which is a term that historians use to try to describe what is connecting a big chunk of conservative evangelicalism by the turn of the 20th century. And it really revolves around Dwight Moody, much like in about 50 years later, it revolves around someone like Billy Graham, where there's so many institutions connected to Billy Graham. By 1900, really, Moody dies in 1899, but his network is really the backbone of evangelicalism, and dispensationalism, or at least the ideas in it, are really central to the Moody movement. So then the 1900 to 1960 is really about how the Moody movement turns into the fundamentalist movement, or at least part of it does. And that's where dispensationalism, that's where the term comes about, is in the 1920s. And dispensationalism really becomes woven into the identity of a big chunk of conservative evangelicalism, but also becomes one part of a sort of conservative Protestant battle where you have the dispensationalists on one side and the covenantalists on the other side. And these covenantalists are the more reformed tradition coming out of the Presbyterian Church and other reformed churches. And if you look at fundamentalism in, say, 1940, 1950, these are the two big camps where there's seminaries and church denominations and church journals all sort of on one side or the other theologically. And we might imagine that situation would go on where there would basically be two subcultures within fundamentalism, and yet that's not how history turned out necessarily. And one of the crazy things, and this is where we get to 1960 to the present, is that for a variety of reasons that I get into, there's this version of dispensationalism that goes popular that basically captures a massive swath of evangelical culture that includes a lot of people who in other ways would be reformed or at least not dispensationalists. And it's through the embrace of mass media, through popular culture, through television and film and other things, that this pop dispensationalism becomes in some ways the default eschatology of American Christianity, at least to the outsiders, to the people who aren't really well informed on all the different divisions. This becomes sort of the way that many people think all Christians believe the world is going to end. And that has all these types of downstream effects on politics, on culture. The reason I call it the fall of dispensationalism is it's a bit ironic. I mean, you might say this is the rise or the solidification of a type of popular dispensationalism. But at the very same time that's happening in the culture, within the seminaries and within the denominations, dispensationalism is facing more and more resistance and more critique. And there's a pretty stunning decline in the academic respectability of dispensationalism from 1960 to the present. And that starts filtering down into the various institutions of the evangelical movement, some of the denominations. I'm part of the Evangelical Free Church here in Madison. In 2019, the Free Church, which was founded as a dispensationalist denomination in 1950, got rid of premillennialism from their statement of faith in 2019. So we're still living that sort of decline, at least in my denomination, and that decline and that rejection of, or that taking out of premillennialism from the statement. It now just says the glorious appearing of Jesus instead of the premillennial appearing of Jesus, is in part because there are so many pastors and leaders in the denomination who are amillennial or mostly amillennial. There aren't many postmillennials in the Evangelical Free Church, or other versions of premillennial, that they thought this was actually constricting the denomination, whereas 70 years ago, it was seen as sort of empowering the denomination. So that idea of a fall, you might not see it as much in pop culture, though I would say that there's a certain type of really unfortunate superficiality, we've already talked a bit about that, and crudeness to the way dispensationalism is used, that I think anyone previous in dispensationalism's history would sort of not endorse. A lot of them would be very troubled by the way their ideas, certainly Darby would be, but even people after him, by the way their ideas are being used in politics and culture and stuff. But in the more academic theological world, there's also been a massive decline that I really wanted to highlight, because I don't think a lot of people who aren't in that world understand just how hard it is to be a sort of full-blown dispensationalist theologian at an evangelical seminary today. It's very rare, unless your seminary is one that has really stayed committed to that, and there aren't that many of those left. So there's a lot I skipped there, but that's a really quick survey of sort of the arc of the story and the points I really wanted to hit.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. And I know for listeners who want to go deeper, obviously they can pick up a copy of the book, and I would encourage them to do that and to go deeper. Just thinking about, you mentioned your own denomination, the Evangelical Free Church, moving away from that premillennial or dispensational theology. And your book is primarily aimed at evangelical Protestants, because the debate over dispensationalism is among evangelicals. But from a historical ancient faith perspective, dispensationalism is more of a novelty in the scope of the entirety of Christian history and Christian theology. From your understanding as a historian, what has been the predominant view of not just end times, but that interpretation of Scripture pre-Reformation in such as like the Catholic Church, the various Orthodox traditions, and like the Church Fathers, and people like Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and those kind of up through the Middle Ages, medieval period.
So I've been able to dialogue with a number of dispensationalist scholars over the last couple of years in very productive ways. But one of their contentions is that dispensationalism is not a novelty, that it actually has deep roots. There's a book that actually came out, I think it was the same month as my book, called Discovering Dispensationalism, and it's published by a small press out in California. But it was full of scholars making this argument historically, saying if you go back and you read certain church fathers and so forth, you can get certain parts of the dispensational tradition going all the way back. I was and continue to be highly skeptical of their argument, but they were. I guess what the credit I want to say is they were trying to make that argument on the terms that we could evaluate the argument as sort of factually right or wrong. And so that is a conversation. I would say outside of that group of scholars, there's very little purchase for the idea that there is anything close to the dispensationalism we see today before the 19th century. You can certainly find, radical mystical monks and so forth talking about the end times, or even proposing something like a rapture. There's certainly speculation about the future of Israel that goes all the way back to goes back to Romans, among other things. So there are elements that you can find earlier, but the idea that there's anything like an interlocking set of beliefs that would make any of those people recognize modern dispensationalism as what they believed is harder for me to believe. But to get to your point about your question about the sort of eschatology of the church, in the early decades, centuries, there is a lot of diversity among the church fathers. There are what we call Chilius or Chilius, the people who did expect the end to come very soon, and what we might call them premillennialists today in the sort of parlance of Protestants and how we talk about eschatology. They were really expecting Christ to return and to establish a kingdom. I mean, it's out, the apostles, at least in the first chapter of Acts, seem to be thinking that that's something until they're disabused of it. But there's also other views that in the early church that we would call more like amillennialist, that see that the church is the kingdom, and that there will be a second coming. That's always been the Orthodox view, is there will be a literal bodily return of Jesus in the future, but that that there isn't. We should read once Revelation, the book of Revelation comes around. What we are reading is not sort of a roadmap or some type of decoding text that lays out in a journalistic way, this will happen and then this will happen and this will happen, but is much more about a spiritual battle or sort of an eternal battle that is being depicted there. But for the first few centuries, there's very much a diversity on these things. So all traditions, including postmillennialism, which is the other popular Protestant tradition, that the church will sort of expand and begin to control the actual society that humans are in until Christ returns and sort of inaugurates a full millennium. You can find different church fathers. This is sort of one of the tricky things about trying to root anything in the church fathers is there's probably a church father that will say something that you can then marshal and say, aha, there is someone in the. So the church fathers did not speak with unity on this. But what the real big turning point on eschatology is actually Augustine, who was a Chiliast in his earliest years, and then rejected that view and thought that was a carnal view, a carnal in the sense that he thought it was far too much about sort of the material world that he thought the future would be like, and a far too apocalyptic view of history. And so Augustine really he's an amillennialist in our terms today, and that becomes the dominant view of the church, certainly church hierarchy, the dogma, for centuries and centuries. And most of the Reformation leaders are also largely amillennialists. Certainly Calvin is, Luther is as well. But with the Reformation, you do start expanding the group of people who are reading the text in their vernacular languages, and you start getting the growth of both a pre and post millennial tradition, largely in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so then you start getting all the diversity, and you get, you're literally getting hundreds of different people looking at these texts, applying different hermeneutics to them, and developing the concepts that we have today. And I believe both post and premillennialism as terms are coined in the 17th century. So you're starting to having to coin terms to talk about different positions on these issues. And that's, we still sort of have that map or that landscape of terms today to try to describe this. But outside of Protestantism, if you look at the Orthodox Church and you look at the Catholic Church today, both of them would be what we would call in the Protestant world amillennial as well. So that's been the majority view over church history and in terms of the majority of Christians. But in the Protestant world, it's been very different. And if you grew up in America in the 20th century and you were in the conservative part of Protestantism, you would think premillennialism was and will always be the dominant view. And it has been in the U.S. for about 100 years. Even if you go back to before the Civil War, it wasn't the dominant view. We were largely a post-millennialist, revivalist type country. And it looks like, based on polling that's been done in the last 10 years or so, that younger evangelicals are also far less likely to be premillennialists than their parents. And so we might be going back to something of what that view looked like before the 20th century. But from 1890 or so, as I tell in my story, to at least the turn of the 21st century, premillennialism was the dominant view, and then dispensationalism being the certain version of premillennialism that was the most popular.
I think that's very helpful to look at that way, going further back in church history, because that's in my own spiritual journey in the last year or so. I've been taking a journey back towards the earlier church, which is why I've moved from a more Baptist tradition into the Anglican, more ancient faith, broadly Catholic tradition. And so I think that's helpful to see, because as we read Scripture, I think that we need to read it in light of the tradition of the church. And I totally agree. You can pinpoint any particular church father and say, hey, this is supporting my theological point of view. But the consensus of the fathers, even if it is broad, I think that we have to interpret and come to our conclusions about theological points through the tradition of the church.
Yeah, I would say eschatology is one of the things that there is a broader array of views in the early church on than other things. There's quite clear unity or consensus, maybe not unity, but consensus on. But eschatology is just one that has had this interesting history of quite diverse views. It's actually remarkable you could say from the 4th century to the 12th century, there was not nearly as much diversity on this view, and that might be the more remarkable period versus earlier and later, where there is a lot of different views. And
I would agree with that, what you were saying regarding the clarity and other specific issues, because end times is one of those things that we don't know what's going to happen because it's in the future. So, but I think more the differing views on eschatology are more helpful than others, particularly as we were talking about dispensationalism. So for the sake of time, I want to give you an opportunity to talk more about an aspect of dispensationalism that can be confusing. And you mentioned it earlier in our conversation, and it regards the relationship between the church and Israel. And you were talking about how the war in Israel, between Israel and Gaza on October 7th, 2023, kind of helped spark some more interest in your book and in the topic around this. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but can you bring a little bit more out in regards to that relationship between dispensational understanding between the church and Israel and how that plays into modern, not just politics, but the modern view of the state of Israel as it has come to be since the 1940s?
Yeah, so for many dispensationalists, the Zionist movement in the early 20th century, the founding of Israel in 1948, the war in 1967 that gave Israel a lot more of the land that it now controls, that these were prophetically significant events, that these fulfilled specific prophecies either made by Jesus in the Matthew or in Revelation or in Daniel. And for that reason, for many dispensationalists, these are almost like empirical proofs that their reading of the Bible is the correct reading because their system predicted these things and then these things came to pass. And so there's been always a desire by dispensationalists to find external proof of their views through global events. And sometimes this has led to egg on the face of dispensationalists. Many of them were surprised by the fall of the Soviet Union because they were so convinced in the 80s and before that the Soviet Union would play this really significant role. I remember distinctly growing up and there was a book on my shelf called The Rise of Babylon, and it had a picture of Saddam Hussein on it. And it was this whole thing about how Saddam Hussein was actually the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar who would restore a Babylon to sort of meet this or that prophecy. Of course, I think most people are now convinced Saddam Hussein was not that figure. So there are ways where this really does backfire on them. And within the community, they often chastise each other for this. Some of this is like date setting, which can be really problematic too, of course. But some of it is also trying to correlate global events with prophecy. Within that tradition, Israel has played this special role because it seems to have fulfilled prophecy over and over again. And so when there is a new big, massive event like the October 7th attacks, the immediate response by many pop dispensationalists, megachurch pastors, and pundits on Christian TV and stuff is to try to find how does this thing fit into prophecy. So I don't even think their first instinct is to necessarily side with Israel in like a political way. That comes later, or that comes with it. But it's really about trying to validate the authority of the Bible or their reading of the Bible by saying this thing that just happened in the world that we're all reading about proves that the Bible's true. And so you can actually, sometimes at least, I can sympathize with that core instinct, which is you want to show the authority of the Bible to everyone in the world. I think it's a really bad way to go about it. I don't think it's actually the right way to read Scripture, but I can sympathize with that impulse, which is to want to almost use it as an evangelistic tool, this fulfillment of prophecy. But that often looks bad in hindsight, and it certainly is not the greatest way to witness to our non-Christian friends about the authority of the Bible, because many of them find it laughable. Often these predictions are false or are not followed up. I sometimes think of it like a sports talk show where people make predictions all the time and no one's held to account when their predictions don't actually come to pass. Like, you're saying this team's going to win. We'll go back to you next week and ask you who's going to win, even if you got it wrong. And there's sort of like a version of that with prophecy analysis as well. But outside of that sort of desire to prove the authority of the Bible, there is an identification of modern Israel with ancient Israel, and believing that both there's a covenant that God has that is everlasting and unchanging with the Jewish people. That means that in any type of conflict today, that God is on Israel's side, essentially, that there is a clear right and wrong, sort of there's an aggressor and there's a defender, and in these wars, Israel is always pitched as the defender, and sometimes rightly so, but giving a sort of sense of whatever modern Israel is doing must be sort of advancing the story of God's people. And this has led in the past to Christian Zionists defending things Israel's done in wars that others would call atrocities or violations of human rights. It has been to basically, in a lot of ways, take the messaging from the Israeli government and then sort of relay that to their audiences, whether that's in their newsletters or TV shows or wherever these evangelical leaders have a platform. And it's also to lobby the US government when they can to be as friendly to Israel in diplomatic terms and giving military aid and all those types of things as possible. And I'm trying to describe this in a neutral terms because you could think all those things are right, that we should be siding with Israel, that we should be supporting Israel with as much diplomacy and weapons as we can. But I would question underneath, if you view that, like, why do you think that's true? And are you basing that on basically a eschatology or some type of hermeneutic? Do you have other reasons that you would make that case? And are those other reasons able to be debated with others in ways that would lead someone to change their mind one way or the other? That's where I see really the breakdown in the Christian Zionist world, is a dogged, uncritical, and often, sometimes we call it like a blank check approach to Israel, because of these deeper theological commitments about the chosenness of modern Israel in God's plans. And what often comes along with that, and you can definitely see this, the largest organization in the country doing this type of work is Christians United for Israel. It's headquartered out of San Antonio. It's headquartered in D.C., but the pastor who runs it is John Hagee out of San Antonio. Along with the pro-Israel sort of rhetoric also comes a lot of analysis of the rest of the Middle East that I think is very questionable as well. And so it's not just how they view Israel, it's how they view the rest of the region that would make you sort of concerned, at least it makes me concerned, about exactly where are they getting their information and how are they filtering that information and how are they representing what they would call a biblical view of Israel. How is that representing to other Christians and to other non-Christians? And is that really what I think a biblical view of Israel is? I think that's where the breakdown comes. But that's been one of the major manifestations of dispensationalism in the last couple generations, has been this quite remarkable grassroots, millions strong activation around the modern state of Israel, to the point that decades ago, we used to talk a lot about the Israel lobby as something that was largely run out of D.C. and was largely led by Jewish leaders in America. And there's still those elements to the support that Americans give to Israel. But by far and away, evangelicals are more numerous and more passionate about this issue than are American Jews at this point. And that's a pretty remarkable thing that you couldn't have predicted a few decades ago, but it's certainly where we're at today.
No, I think that your analysis there is very helpful, and just thinking about the last few years since the war began, and at the time of this recording is technically under ceasefire, but still some ongoing issues there. But this sense in which you use the word blank check, and that's and not to get too deep into politics and that sort of thing in this conversation, but I think there's a lot of, particularly Christians in America, think that you can't criticize Israel for anything, or you're seen as anti-Semitic. And so the idea that Israel is over here dropping bombs on innocent Gazans, but if you speak to the fact that, well, these Gazans need aid, these Gazans need food, and maybe they need to be evacuated and that sort of thing, well, then now you're being anti-Semitic. And so to me, you can speak to both. You can it's not anti-Semitic to say, Israel, you're wrong in this particular situation in what you're doing in this bombing campaign or whatever. And yes, we're called to love the least of these, particularly people who are in a war-torn country who can't really defend themselves. And so that nuance there is not necessarily seen in our political discussions today. You're either seen on the left or on the right, and there's really no room for talk in the middle there. Which I think is that's definitely where I land on the issue, but maybe other people do as well, but don't want to go down that path.
Yeah, it's really complicated, and it's something that I think unfortunately suffers from some of the same things we were talking about before, about sort of how are Christians being formed when they come to this issue. What are the things they're reading? What are the things they're consuming that are giving them even the impressions of what's happening in the Middle East? And I think that that's one area where at the local church level is probably the the place where most of us have some type of ability to change things. But it's not just reading neutral sources or something like that. It's also thinking about these things within a broader theological and biblical worldview and trying to understand what we're called to do. One of the most popular verses for Christian Zionists is Genesis 12:3, where God tells Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." And there's this just like immediate application of this verse for supporting Israel, which is, well, we must bless the seed of Abraham, and that's what we're commanded to do. And there's definitely another way to read that verse that wouldn't lead you to that specific application. But even if it did, even if you agreed like, oh yes, this is telling me I need to bless modern Israel, I think the next question is, what does it mean to bless modern Israel? Is it to sanction every action they do and to sort of just say, well, those Israeli politicians must know what's best? Or is it to try to somehow advocate for a biblically grounded view of justice in the region that would mean that you're criticizing anyone or everyone who is committing atrocities or who is not being entirely transparent with what they're doing, all that kind of stuff. And so even the term bless is just sort of within that world taken to mean something obvious. And I think a biblical view of what it means to bless others is not so black and white, and would lead to a good conversation in a local church setting. At least it gets really complicated when you get beyond the local church setting on these things. But a local church setting, to think about what are we called to do in this situation? And even if we think we're called to, in some special way, bless the Jewish people or bless the state of Israel, what does that actually mean in terms of what I should be advocating for, where I should be giving my money, what I should be expecting my politicians to say? All those types of things, I think, need to be thought through really carefully.
Amen, amen. And to quote Mark Knoll from your forward to your book, we've barely scratched the surface, and there's much more that we could have gone into today. So as we wrap up our conversation today, one last question that I have for you is, do you have any current or future writing projects in the works or planned?
Yeah, I have another book I'm working on with Eerdman's, which published the Dispensationalism book. And it's a history of American evangelical history, but history of ideas of sanctification and holiness in American evangelicalism, starting with the Keswick movement, which is a somewhat popular movement in the 1870s and 1880s, and going all the way through today to people like Dallas Willard and John Mark Comer and some of the people there. So I'm about halfway through that project. I hope to be done with it next year in 2026. But I'm deep into that stuff too. It's interesting actually how much overlap some of the characters have with the people in the Dispensationalism book, people like Schofield. But it's also a much different topic with certainly a lot less Israel and modern Israel in it. But yeah, that's what I'm working on right now.
Well, that sounds very interesting, and we definitely, whenever that book comes out, have to have you on, and we can continue a conversation about that and maybe this broader topic of eschatology. But yeah, I definitely would love to have you back on. Well, thank you again for joining us today on the Reading for the Glory podcast. As I just mentioned, we'd have to have you on soon. I've enjoyed this conversation today.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I'll have a link to the book in today's show notes so that our listeners can find a way to pick up a copy of that. If you have a question or a comment or would like to drop us a note, you can check us out on social media. We're on Facebook, X, Threads, and Instagram. You can also check us out on YouTube. Be sure to go to readingfortheglory.com to stay up to date on the latest articles, book reviews, and podcasts. And if you'd like to write us an email, you can do that at readingfortheglory.com/contact. Well, we look forward to having you join us again next time on the Reading for the Glory podcast as we discover truth, goodness, and beauty through the written word.